The moment the cameras flashed and the entire elite circle of New York froze in disbelief, a billionaire lady fell in love with a poor boy. And how it happened shocked everyone watching the spectacle unfold. Victoria Laurent, the youngest, most untouchable billionaire lady in the city's history, stepped off the velvet podium. But instead of taking the hand of a prince, she slipped a simple, weathered ring onto the calloused finger of a silent street cleaner. Gasps echoed through the ballroom as the Queen of Cold knelt before a man who owned nothing. But the way she looked at him held a devotion no amount of money could ever buy. The world saw a billionaire lady throwing away her status for a poor boy from the shadows. But Victoria knew the truth that shocked everyone. This invisible man had already paid for her life with his own blood long before she even knew his name. How did a woman who trusted no one surrender her heart to a man the world refuses to see? What dark corporate secret linked this billionaire lady to the poor boy's tragic past? And why did their union send shivers through the city's most powerful boardrooms? The penthouse office of Laurent Global didn't feel like a workspace. It felt like a vacuum. Situated on the 84th floor, the floor-to-ceiling glass offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, a glittering kingdom of steel and ego. To the world, Victoria Laurent was the queen of this realm, a billionaire lady whose net worth was calculated in 11 figures. To herself, she was a prisoner in a suit of armor made of silk and sapphire. Victoria moved with a clinical precision that unnerved her board of directors, her heels clicking against the marble like a countdown. Today, she stood by the window, her reflection ghosting against the sunset. She wasn't looking at the view. She was looking at the smudge on the glass, a tiny imperfection in her perfect world. The merger papers for the Tokyo account are ready. Ms. Laurent, her assistant, Marcus, murmured from the doorway. He didn't step inside. No one stepped into her inner sanctum without an invitation. The board is questioning the delay on the construction permits for the New Heights project. The board can wait, Marcus, and tell my uncle to stop sending his consultants to my floor. I know exactly whose payroll they are on, Victoria said, her voice like velvet wrapped around a blade dot as Marcus retreated. Victoria's gaze drifted to the mahogany desk in the corner of the desk that had once belonged to her father, Arthur Laurent. It had been 5 years since the night that shattered her reality. The public narrative was sudden heart failure, a tragic end for a titan of industry. But Victoria's mind was a vault, and she frequently relived the one memory she couldn't delete. She remembered walking into her father's study that night and finding him collapsed beside an open safe. Nothing was stolen, except one blue file. Her father had once warned her, "If anything happens to me, trust no one, not even those who claim to protect you." That moment had rewired her, making her cold and calculated. Even her fiancé at the time, Daniel Reeves, had been part of the rot. He had always asked about company passwords and avoided conversations about loyalty, once joking that power mattered more than love. Weeks after her father's death, she discovered Daniel had been secretly working with a rival. She had ended the engagement publicly, humiliating him, and vowed that no one would ever get close enough to hurt her again. Meanwhile, miles below the glass towers, Ethan Cole lived a life invisible to people like Victoria. At 26, Ethan's world was defined by the grit of the pavement and the smell of exhaust. He was currently finishing his dawn shift as a street cleaner, his orange vest faded, and his boots worn thin. He had no degree and no safety net, but he possessed a quiet, dangerous integrity. As he pushed his broom past the gleaming lobby of a Laurent subsidiary, he felt a familiar phantom pain in his chest. At 12 years old, Ethan had watched his father, a construction worker, die in a building collapse caused by corporate negligence. The company responsible was a subsidiary of Laurent Global. While he didn't blame the young heiress personally, the name Laurent was a scar on his history. He remembered his mother's voice through the grief. "We may be poor, Ethan, but never be small." This history made him pause near the luxury cars lining the curb, not out of envy, but out of a deep-seated distrust for the power they represented. He was a man who saw the world's machinery from the bottom up. Noticing the frayed cables and the cracked foundations that the billionaire's above ignored, Victoria grabbed her coat, a simple, unbranded wool wrap, and headed for the private elevator. She needed to breathe. She needed to be someone who wasn't a billionaire lady for just 1 hour. She stepped out into the humid New York air, walking toward a busy intersection, her mind drifting back to that missing blue file and her uncle's predatory smile at the last board meeting. She didn't notice the black sedan running a red light. Its engine roaring, it veered toward the crosswalk. She didn't see the danger, but the boy who was trained by tragedy to watch for falling structures saw everything. Ethan dropped his broom, his muscles reacting before his brain could process the risk. He lunged forward, his world narrowing down to the woman in the simple coat who had no idea her life was about to end. The screech of tires against asphalt sounded like a dying animal, a high-pitched wail that tore through the mundane hum of the morning. Victoria Laurent, a billionaire lady usually insulated by bulletproof glass and executive security, felt the rush of wind as the black sedan missed her by less than an inch. Before she could scream, a pair of strong, calloused hands slammed into her shoulders, shoving her violently toward the sidewalk. She hit the concrete hard, the air driven from her lungs in a sharp gasp. For a moment, the world was a blur of grey pavement and the smell of burnt rubber. She looked up, her vision swimming, to see a young man standing over her, his chest heaving under a faded orange vest. Ethan Cole didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who had been tired for a decade. He didn't offer a hand to help her up immediately. Instead, he watched the sedan disappear into the labyrinth of Manhattan traffic, his jaw tight. He remembered a similar sound from his childhood, the roar of a crane snapping, the thunder of falling bricks. That day, no one had been fast enough to push his father out of the way. The major twist of his life was written in the scars on his palms, earned from digging through rubble that Laurent Global's lawyers had later dismissed as an unfortunate site incident. He looked down at the woman on the ground. She wore a simple coat, her hair disheveled, but there was an unmistakable spark of authority in her eyes that she couldn't quite hide. "Are you trying to get killed?" Ethan's voice was gruff, devoid of the sycophancy Victoria was used to. The light was red. "You weren't even looking." Victoria blinked, stunned by the bluntness. "I was distracted. Thank you. You saved my life." She reached into her pocket, her instinct as a billionaire lady, immediately searching for her leather wallet to offer a reward, to turn this life debt into a transaction. But as her fingers touched the cool ostrich skin, she paused. Something about the way he stood shoulders square, eyes scanning the street instead of her face, stopped her. "I don't need your money, lady," Ethan said, as if reading her mind. He picked up his discarded broom, the wooden handle smooth from years of use. "Just watch where you're going. Not everyone gets a second chance in this city." He didn't ask for her name. He didn't linger to see if she was famous. He simply turned and began sweeping the debris from the curb, his movements rhythmic and purposeful. Victoria stood up, brushing the grit from her wool wrap. She felt a strange, prickling sensation in her chest. Curiosity. In her world, every chance encounter was engineered. When she was 23, her fiancé Daniel had coincidentally been at the same gallery opening she attended, spilling wine on his sleeve just to start a conversation. Later, she found the receipt for the gallery's guest list in his desk. He had hunted her like prey. But this poor boy was walking away from a woman who looked like she could afford to pay his rent for a lifetime. He was the first person in 5 years who hadn't looked at her as a series of dollar signs. As she watched him disappear into the crowd, Victoria noticed a small detail, a faded tattoo on his forearm, a set of coordinates that looked hauntingly familiar. She didn't realize yet that those numbers pointed to the very construction site where her father's blue folder secrets were buried. The foreshadowing of their shared trauma was etched into his skin. A silent alarm she wasn't yet equipped to hear. She pulled out her phone and dialed Marcus. "Track the GPS on my current location," she commanded, her voice regaining its billionaire edge. "There's a street cleaner in an orange vest, heading north on 5th. I want to know everything about him. Not for a lawsuit, for an investigation." An investigation into what, Ms. Laurent? Marcus asked, his tone cautious. Into why a man who has nothing would want nothing from me, she replied, her gaze fixed on the spot where Ethan had stood. She walked back toward her office, the adrenaline still humming in her veins. She didn't know that Ethan was currently glancing back at her, his mind flickering to a memory of his mother crying over a legal settlement check that wouldn't even cover the funeral costs. He didn't know she was the face of the empire that broke his family, and she didn't know he was the only man alive who could help her find the truth behind her father's death. The logic gap of their meeting was closed by fate. She was looking for a truth she couldn't buy, and he was the only one who possessed it without knowing its value. The air in the high-tech surveillance suite of Laurent Global was frigid, the hum of servers providing a rhythmic heartbeat to Victoria's growing obsession. She sat in a swivel chair, the glow of a dozen monitors reflecting in her dark eyes. On the central screen, a grainy image from a traffic camera played on a loop, a young man in a faded orange vest lunging into the path of a speeding car. He moved with a selflessness that didn't exist in her tax bracket. His name is Ethan Cole, Marcus said, his voice hesitant as he stood behind her. 26, no criminal record, no bank accounts with more than 3 digits, and no permanent address. He moves between a studio in Queens and the night shift at Mercy Hospital. He's a ghost, Ms. Laurent, a nobody. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she watched Ethan walk away from the accident on screen, without a backward glance. A nobody who didn't want a reward. In this city, she tapped a key, freezing the frame on the tattoo on his forearm. Zoom in on this. These coordinates, they aren't random. As the image sharpened, the major twist setup began to crystallize in her mind. The numbers etched into Ethan's skin were the exact longitude and latitude of the Shoreline District, the site of the infamous 2012 building collapse. It was the disaster that had nearly bankrupted her father's company before the legal teams buried it under a mountain of NDAs. Flashback, 10 years ago. Victoria remembered sitting at the dinner table when she was 18, watching her father, Arthur, stare at a news report of the collapse. He hadn't looked like a titan then. He had looked like a man haunted by a ghost. The shortcuts, Victoria, he had whispered, not looking at her. They told me the steel was reinforced. They lied to me. And now, families are buried under my name. He had reached for a blue folder on the table, the same one that would disappear the night of his death. If I ever find the proof of who authorized those cuts, I'll burn this empire to the ground to make it right. Present day, the realization hit Victoria like a physical blow. Ethan Cole wasn't just a stranger. He was a living reminder of her family's greatest sin. She felt a surge of guilt, but beneath it, a sharper, more calculating thought. If Ethan was connected to that site, he might know something the legal files didn't show. Find out where he works his second job, Victoria commanded. And Marcus, get me a pair of jeans and a hooded sweatshirt. I'm going back out. Ms. Laurent, your uncle has called 3 times about the board meeting, Marcus warned. He's already questioning your erratic behavior. If he finds out you're chasing a street cleaner ... let him wonder. Victoria snapped. My uncle spent 20 years protecting this company. Maybe it's time someone looked at what he was protecting it from. The foreshadowing of her uncle's involvement was a cold weight in her stomach. She remembered how he had stepped into the CEO role temporarily after her father's death, his first act being to shred a backlog of old construction invoices. At the time, she thought it was efficiency. Now, she realized it was an execution. 2 hours later, Victoria stood in the shadows of a flickering street lamp outside a diner in Queens. She looked nothing like a billionaire lady. Her designer hair was tucked under a beanie, and her face was scrubbed clean of the queen of cold persona. She watched as Ethan stepped out of a delivery bike. His shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but his expression remains unyielding. She stepped into his path, her heart hammering against her ribs, a sensation she hadn't felt since her father was alive. You again, she said softly. Ethan stopped, his eyes scanning her. He didn't recognize the wealthy woman from the morning. He only saw a girl who looked as tired as he felt. You following me? Or do you just have a habit of standing in dangerous places? I wanted to say thank you. Properly, Victoria lied, her voice steady. I didn't get your name. Ethan, he said, turning back to his bike. And you don't owe me anything. Just go home, kid. The streets aren't safe for people who look like they've never had to fight for a meal. What if I told you you're looking for the truth about something that happened a long time ago? She asked, the core foundation of her mission slipping out. Ethan froze, his hand tightening on the handlebars. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a second, the poor boy and the billionaire lady were just two souls standing in the rain, bound by a secret that was about to shatter New York. Truth is expensive, Ethan replied quietly. Most people can't afford the price. Scene 4. The Invisible Man's bedenthe neon's fine of the Midnight Express diner flickered, casting rhythmic blue light over Ethan's tired features. He didn't look at Victoria, with the hunger she was used to from men in her social circle. He looked at her with the weary caution of a man who had spent his life dodging blows from a world that didn't want him. You talk about the truth like it's a hobby, Ethan said, his voice straining against the rumble of a passing subway train. But for people like me, the truth is a luxury we can't afford. It's what gets you fired. It's what gets you buried. He began walking toward a small, rusted locker behind the diner, and Victoria followed, her expensive boots clicking softly on the oil-stained pavement. She felt the sharp contrast of her existence, the billionaire lady playing at being ordinary, but the weight of her father's blue folder felt heavier here in her shadows than it ever did in her penthouse. I'm not looking for a hobby, Ethan, Victoria said, stepping into the light of a buzzing street lamp. I'm looking for a name. Someone who signed a paper 10 years ago. Someone who thought lives were cheaper than steel. Ethan froze. The mention of 10 years ago acted like a physical strike. He turned slowly, his eyes dropping to his own forearm, where the coordinates of the shoreline collapse were permanently etched. Flashback, 12 years ago. The memory hit him with the force of a collapsing wall. A 12-year-old Ethan had been sitting on a plastic crate, eating a sandwich his father, Thomas, had shared with him during a lunch break at the Laurent construction site. Look at the sky, Ethan, Thomas had said, pointing at the rising skeletal frame of the building. We're building the future. But then, Thomas had leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. Something's wrong with the girders, son. They're grade B, marked as grade A, I told the foreman, but he told me to shut up or get off the payroll. I kept a log. If they don't fix it, this future is going to fall. Hours later, the sky didn't just fall, it screamed. The sound of shearing metal was followed by a cloud of red dust that swallowed his father whole. Present-day Ethan's hand trembled slightly as he grabbed a grimy thermos from his locker. You're asking about the Shoreline District. You're a decade too late, lady. The lawyers won. The Lawrence won. They always win. Not this time, Victoria countered, her voice dropping an octave, losing the practice lilt of the elite. What if I told you the man who ran that company died because he was trying to expose the person who ignored your father's warnings? Ethan's head snapped up. This was the major twist setup he never expected. He had spent years hating the name Laurent as a monolith of evil, but this woman was suggesting a rift in the fortress. He stepped closer, his personal space usually a fortress of its own, but his curiosity was a bridge he couldn't stop himself from crossing. How do you know about the warnings? Ethan demanded, his eyes searching hers. The official report said it was unforeseeable soil erosion. My father's logbook ... It vanished from the site the day he died. Victoria felt a chill. The logbook. That was likely what her father had found. The blue folder was the evidence Ethan's father had died trying to protect. The logic gap was closing. They weren't just two strangers meeting by chance. They were the two ends of a blood-stained thread. I know because I have the shadows of the truth, she said, leaning against the cold brick wall. But I need someone who was there. Someone who doesn't work for a board of directors. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and for a split second, he saw past the beanie and the sweatshirt. He saw a woman who was haunted by the same ghosts he was. But before he could speak, a black SUV with tinted windows drifted slowly past the alleyway. The foreshadowing of her uncle's reach was no longer a theory. Victoria recognized the license plate. Her security wasn't just tracking her for safety. They were monitoring who she spoke to. "I have to go," Victoria whispered, her heart racing. "Meet me tomorrow at the fountain in Central Park, noon. Don't wear the vest. Just ... Come as yourself." "Why should I trust you?" Ethan asked, his voice a low growl of suspicion. "Because," Victoria said, stepping back into the darkness, "I'm the only one who knows that your father wasn't just a victim. He was a witness." She vanished before he could respond, leaving Ethan standing in the flickering neon light, the weight of his past suddenly feeling like a weapon he finally knew how to aim. Does this scene meet your approval? May I proceed to scene 5? The Masquerade of Noon. The Bethesda Fountain in Central Park was a chaotic symphony of tourists, street performers, and golden afternoon light. Victoria stood by the stone edge, her reflection shimmering in the water. She wore a simple sundress and oversized sunglasses, looking like any other woman enjoying the spring air, but her hands were shoved deep into her pockets, clutching a burner phone Marcus had secured for her. This was the engineered fate she had designed, a meeting point where the elite and the invisible could collide, without drawing the eyes of her uncle's security detail. When she saw him, her breath caught. Ethan wasn't wearing the faded orange vest. He was in a clean, charcoal grey t-shirt that hugged his frame. His posture no longer slumped by the weight of a broom. He looked like a man who belonged in the sun. But the way his eyes constantly scanned the tree line for threats told a different story. He didn't approach her with a smile. He approached her like a soldier entering a neutral zone. "You look different," Ethan said, stopping a few feet away. "Less like a girl hiding in an alley, more like someone who owns the park." "Maybe I just like the view," Victoria replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Did you bring what I asked for? The date of the collapse, the names of the foreman?" Ethan sat on the edge of the fountain, trailing his fingers through the water. "I don't need to bring names I've memorized every night for 12 years. The man in charge of the shoreline site was a guy named Miller. He disappeared a week after the funeral, but there was someone above him, someone who signed the change orders for the steel." Flashback, 3 years ago, Victoria remembered a charity gala, where she had been forced to stand beside her fiancé, Daniel Reeves. They were hosting a group of investors, and her uncle, Richard Laurent, had been holding court. "Construction is about efficiency, Daniel," Richard had said, swirling a glass of amber scotch. "Sometimes you have to trim the fat to build the bone." Daniel had laughed, but Victoria had caught the way he looked at her uncle, not with respect, but with the look of a man who knew where the bodies were buried. Later that night, she found a digital key in Daniel's tuxedo pocket. When she asked him about it, he had brushed it off as boring logistics, but his eyes had turned cold. It was the first time she realized Daniel wasn't just a social climber. He was a spy. Present day, the steel orders were signed by the director of operations, Victoria whispered, the step 3 foreshadowing finally clicking into a sharp, painful reality. "That was my uncle's position before my father died." Ethan looked up, his gaze piercing. "Your uncle? So you're not just some researcher, you're a Laurent." He stood up abruptly, the water break beginning to crumble. "I saved the life of the woman whose family killed my father. Is this a joke to you? Some kind of rich girl guilt trip?" "It's not a joke, Ethan. My father died trying to fix what they did." Victoria grabbed his arm, her silk sleeve brushing against his calloused skin. "He found the file. He found the proof that the collapse wasn't an accident, it was a murder for profit. And then he was killed for it. I'm not here to apologize for them. I'm here to finish what he started." Ethan stared at her hand on his arm. In the distance, a group of businessmen in sharp suits walked by, their laughter echoing off the stone. They were the world Ethan hated, but Victoria was the bridge he never thought he'd cross. He felt the logic gap of his resentment battling with the truth in her eyes. "If you're lying to me," Ethan said, his voice a low, Dangerous warning. I'll make sure the world knows exactly who you are. I'm counting on it, Victoria replied. Suddenly, the burner phone in her pocket vibrated. A text from Marcus. Security has breached the park perimeter. They've flagged a suspicious individual near the fountain. Leave now. Victoria looked at Ethan, her heart hammering. They're coming. If they see us together, you're in danger. Go toward the boathouse. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you, Ethan said. His instinct to protect her, the same one that saved her from the car surging back. You have to. If you stay, we lose the only leverage we have, she urged. Meet me at the night shift. At the hospital. I'll bring the first piece of the file. Ethan hesitated, then nodded, vanishing into the crowd with the silent grace of a man used to being invisible. Victoria turned toward the approaching security team, her face hardening back into the mask of a billionaire lady. She was the queen again, but for the first time, she had an ally in the shadows. The sterile, fluorescent hum of Mercy Hospital, 2 a.m., was a world away from the gilded ballrooms of the Upper East Side. Victoria stood in the shadows of the service entrance, her heart racing beneath a heavy utility jacket. She wasn't here as a billionaire lady. She was a woman hunting for the truth, in the one place where status meant nothing. The emergency ward. Ethan appeared from the gloom, pushing a heavy industrial floor buffer. The rhythmic whir slap of the machine stopped as he saw her. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes a testament to his three-job life. But the way he straightened his shoulders when he saw her spoke of a resilience she had never encountered in her social circles. You're late, Ethan said, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of a gloved hand. I almost thought your security had finally locked you in the tower. I had to lose them at a gallery opening. I climbed out of a bathroom window, Victoria admitted, a small, genuine smile breaking through her icy exterior. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a slim, encrypted tablet. I found it. The first layer of the blue folder. My father didn't just have a list of names. He had the original soil reports from the shoreline site. They retreated into a quiet corner of the supply closet, surrounded by the scent of pine cleaner and bleach. As Victoria swiped through the digital files, the blue light illuminated their faces, drawing them into a shared, intimate circle. Look at this, Victoria whispered, pointing to a scanned document. The soil density was flagged as unstable 3 months before construction began. My father saw this, but someone had overwritten his signature with a digital forge. He wasn't the one who ignored the warning. Ethan. He was the one who was framed for it. Flashback. 2 years ago, Victoria remembered a quiet evening at the Laurent estate. Shortly after she had taken over the company, she had been sitting in the library, trying to make sense of the chaotic ledger her father had left behind. Her uncle, Richard, had walked in, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. Don't dig too deep, Victoria, he had said, his voice dripping with faux concern. Arthur was a great man, but he was tired. He made mistakes at the end. It's better for the Laurent name, is those mistakes stay buried. She had looked up at him, noting the way his hand gripped the back of her chair, knuckles white, eyes fixed on the ledger. It wasn't concern, it was a threat. Present day. Ethan leaned in closer to see the screen, his shoulder brushing against hers. For a moment, the mission was forgotten, as the proximity sparked a different kind of electricity. Victoria noticed the faint scent of soap and old parchment on him. He spent his free time in libraries, she realized, trying to educate himself on the laws that had failed him. My father always told me the world was built on top of people like us, Ethan said softly, his gaze dropping from the screen to Victoria's eyes. I hated you for a long time. Not you, specifically, but the person I thought you were. Someone who only saw the building, never the people under it. I was taught that the building was everything, Victoria confessed, her voice barely a whisper. But since I met you, I realize I've been living in a house of cards. You could walk away, Ethan said, his voice holding a trace of a challenge. You have the money. You could leave the city, change your name, and never look back. Why stay and fight for a man who's already gone? Victoria looked at the file on the screen, the proof of a corporate murder. Because he was the only one who didn't lie to me. And because you're the only one who's ever looked at me and seen a person instead of a portfolio. The growing connection was no longer just about the investigation. It was about the way Ethan held the door open for her. Not because she was a billionaire lady, but because he respected her. It was about the way Victoria didn't flinch at his calloused hands. I don't trust rich people much, Ethan reminded her, his eyes lingering on hers. They always take more than they give. What if one of them was different? Victoria asked, echoing her own thoughts from the park. Ethan looked at her for a long beat, the silence in the supply closet heavy with unspoken words. Then they'd have to prove it, he said quietly. And you're getting close, Victoria. But the closer you get to the truth, the more the wolves will howl. The foreshadowing of the coming storm felt like a physical chill. They were two people from different worlds, united by a tragedy that should have kept them apart. But as Ethan reached out and tentatively tucked a stray hair behind her ear, Victoria knew she would burn her empire to the ground to keep this poor boy safe. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a sea of shimmering silk, sharp tuxedos, and the clinking of crystal. This was the Laurent Global Annual Charity Gala night designed to polish the family's image, but for Victoria, it felt like walking into a nest of vipers. She stood at the top of the marble staircase in a gown of midnight velvet, her diamonds catching the light like cold stars. Beside her stood her uncle, Richard, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. You've been distracted lately, Victoria. Richard leaned in, his voice a low, paternal purr that made her skin crawl. People are talking. They say you've been seen in places a Laurent doesn't belong. Remember, the legacy is fragile. Don't let a momentary curiosity break it. Victoria didn't flinch. The legacy was built on a foundation of secrets, uncle. I'm just making sure the cracks aren't showing. She scanned the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had done something reckless. She had sent a formal invitation, hand-delivered by Marcus, to a small studio in Queens. She wanted to know if the growing connection they shared could survive the blinding light of her reality. She wanted to see if Ethan Cole would look at the billionaire lady and still see the woman from the hospital closet. Then, the heavy oak doors opened. The room didn't go silent immediately, but a ripple of confusion spread from the entrance. Ethan walked in, wearing a suit that was clearly a rental, the sleeves a fraction too short, the fabric lacking the sheen of the Italian wool surrounding him. He didn't belong here, and he knew it, but he carried himself with a raw, quiet dignity that made the men in $10,000 tuxedos look small. Victoria stepped away from her uncle and began the long walk across the ballroom. The whispers started instantly. Who is that? Is he a new tech consultant? He looks like ... labor. You came, Victoria said, reaching him. Her voice was soft, an island of truth in a sea of artifice. Ethan's expression was hardened, his eyes sweeping over the gold-leafed pillars, and the waiters carrying trays of caviar that cost more than his monthly rent. I shouldn't have, he said, his voice a low vibration of anger. You told me you were different. But look at this, Victoria. This isn't a life. It's a monument to everything my father died to build for people who don't even know his name. Flashback. 1 year ago, Victoria remembered sitting across from her then-fiancé, Daniel Reeves, at a similar event. Daniel had leaned over his champagne and whispered, "Look at them, Victoria. The little people outside the gates. They exist so we can have this. That's the natural order." She had felt a sick twist in her stomach then, the same step 3 foreshadowing that had warned her Daniel was a predator. He didn't see people. He saw resources. Present day, I wanted you to see the world I'm willing to leave behind, Victoria whispered, stepping closer, ignoring the cameras that were already beginning to flash. You didn't leave it behind, Ethan countered, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp pain. You invited me into the cage to show me how high the bars are. You lied to me, Victoria. You didn't tell me you were the one at the top of the tower that fell on my father. I didn't know then. I'm trying to fix it. You can't fix a grave with a gala. Ethan turned, His jaw set. The wall to break was complete. The reality of her wealth was a physical barrier between them. He began to walk away, pushing past a startled waiter. "Ethan, wait," Victoria called out, but Richard was suddenly there, blocking her path, a smug, knowing smile on his face. "Let him go." "Victoria," Richard said, his eyes cold as flint. "He was never one of us, and he never will be." As Ethan disappeared through the doors, Victoria felt a piece of her heart go with him. But as she watched him leave, she saw Marcus nodding to her from the shadows. The plan was in motion. She hadn't just invited Ethan to a party. She had invited him to witness the moment. She began to burn the Laurent legacy to the ground, foreshadowing her next move. She reached into her clutch and felt the weight of the digital drive containing the full, unredacted shoreline reports. The truth was about to go viral, and no amount of billionaire status could stop the coming storm. The reigning queens didn't fall. It drowned. It hammered against the corrugated metal roof of the warehouse where Ethan lived, a rhythmic, lonely sound that matched the heavy thud of his heart. He sat on a milk crate, still wearing the cheap rental trousers, though he'd long since ripped off the tie and jacket. He felt like a fool. He had let himself believe that a billionaire lady could see a poor boy as an equal. But the gala had been a cold reminder. She lived in the clouds, and he lived in the dirt. A sharp, insistent knock at his door broke the silence. Ethan didn't move. He expected it to be a process server or a landlord. Instead, a slim, blue envelope was slid under the heavy steel door. It wasn't a bill. It was marked with the personal seal of Arthur Laurent, a crest Ethan had hated since he was 12. He tore it open, his hands shaking with a mix of rage and curiosity. Inside wasn't a check or an apology. It was a digital drive and a single, handwritten note on heavy cream paper. "I didn't know then, but I know now. I won't protect the guilty even if they share my name." Ethan plugged the drive into his battered laptop. The screen flickered to life, revealing a hidden directory titled Project Blue Folder. As he clicked through the files, the major twist of his life finally came into focus. These weren't just company records. They were a confession. Flashback, 12 years ago, Ethan remembered his father, Thomas, coming home the night before the collapse. He had been covered in grey dust, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "I found the memo, Ethan," Thomas had whispered, tucking a piece of paper into his son's school notebook. "Richard Laurent authorized the grade be steel. He told the supplier that accidents happen, but profits are certain. If I take this to Arthur, he'll fix it. He's a good man, just surrounded by wolves." But Thomas never made it to Arthur. The building fell first, and the notebook had been lost in the chaos of the sirens and the rubble. Present day on the screen, a scanned image of that very memo appeared. It was signed in a bold, arrogant hand, Richard Laurent. But below it was something else, a recorded audio file from 5 years ago. Victoria's father, Arthur, speaking to a private investigator. "I found it." Arthur's voice crackled through the cheap speakers, sounding frail but determined. "Richard killed those men at the shoreline site. He forged my name. I'm going to the district attorney tomorrow. If anything happens to me, make sure Victoria gets the blue folder. She's the only one left with a soul in this family." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. All these years, he had hated the daughter for the sins of the uncle. But the daughter was the one who had spent 5 years hunting for the truth that would destroy her own family's wealth. Victoria wasn't his enemy. She was his father's final witness. The foreshadowing of Richard's cruelty suddenly took on a lethal weight. Ethan realized that if Victoria had sent him this, she was no longer safe. She had officially declared war on the man who had already killed 2 people to keep this secret. He stood up, grabbing his old work jacket. He didn't have a car or a security detail, but he had the truth, and for the first time in 12 years, he had something worth fighting for that wasn't just his own survival. "She's in trouble," Ethan muttered, the step 5 emotional anchor of his father's memory finally aligning with his feelings for Victoria. He looked at the coordinates on his arm, the place where his life ended. It was time to go to the place where hers began. The neon-lit streets of Queens blurred as Ethan pushed his beat-up bike to its absolute limit, the rain slicking his hair against his forehead. His lungs burned, but the fire in his chest wasn't from the exertion, it was from the crushing realization of who Victoria Laurent really was. He had spent a decade sharpening his hatred against her name, using it as a shield to protect himself from the pain of his father's death. Now, that shield had shattered, revealing a woman who was standing alone in a fortress of glass, surrounded by the same monsters that had buried his father. He pulled up to a red light, his breath hitching as he stared at the glowing Laurent Global logo atop the distant skyscraper. It looked like a beacon, but he knew it was a target. Flashback to hours ago, Victoria had sat in the back of her town car to the gala, her face illuminated by the passing streetlights. Marcus was driving in silence. "You're sure about this, Ms. Laurent?" Marcus had asked, his eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror. "If you leak that file to the boy, Richard will know. He's already moved the security teams to your private residence. He isn't protecting you anymore. He's containing you." Victoria had looked at the blue folder in her lap, her fingers tracing the embossed Laurent crest. "My father died for this, Marcus. Ethan's father died for this. If I have to lose everything to give them justice, then I never really owned it anyway." She had looked out the window at a street cleaner working the midnight shift, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "I spent my life thinking I was the one with the power. But Ethan ... he's the only one who's actually free." Present-day Ethan finally understood the step 5 emotional anchor of their connection. It wasn't just that they were both victims. It was that Victoria was willing to commit social and financial suicide to prove she was different. She wasn't just a billionaire lady playing at being a hero. She was a woman who had been waiting her whole life for someone to give her a reason to fight back. He reached the perimeter of the Laurent estate. The towering wrought iron gates locked tight. Usually, a man like Ethan wouldn't even be able to get past the sidewalk. But tonight, the gates were slightly ajar, a chilling sign that the security had already made their move. Inside the main hall, the air was thick with tension. Victoria stood at the top of the grand staircase, her midnight velvet gown or a battle uniform. Standing below her was Richard, no longer the doting uncle, his face twisted into a mask of corporate coldness. "You were always too much like Arthur." "Victoria," Richard said, his voice echoing in the marble foyer. "Too much heart, not enough stomach for the business. Did you really think I wouldn't find out about the file? Did you think that poor boy could save you?" "He already saved me, Richard," Victoria replied, her voice echoing with a strength that didn't come from her bank account. "He showed me that a man with nothing can have more integrity than a man with everything. The file is already gone. It's with the only person in this city who can't be bought." Richard's eyes narrowed, a predatory glint appearing as he signaled the 2 guards flanking him. "Then he's a dead man. And you're going to have a very public breakdown that requires you to step down." Suddenly, the heavy front doors burst open. Ethan stood there, drenched, trembling with rage, holding the digital drive high like a detonator. "The file isn't just with me, Richard," Ethan shouted, his voice cracking the silence. "I just uploaded the contents to every major news outlet in the city, using your own guest Wi-Fi. It's over." The realization hit Richard like a physical blow. He looked from the poor boy in the doorway to the billionaire lady on the stairs. They were 2 ends of a broken bridge that had finally fused back together. Victoria looked down at Ethan, and in that moment, the world of status and wealth evaporated. She didn't see a street cleaner, and he didn't see an heiress. They saw the truth. The grand auditorium of the New York Stock Exchange was packed to capacity, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the electric hum of a scandal that had gripped the world for 48 hours. Every major news network was live. The blue folder leak had decimated Laurent Global stock, and Richard Laurent had been led away in handcuffs only hours before. Now, the world waited for the billionaire lady to address the wreckage of her empire. Victoria stepped onto the stage. She wasn't wearing the midnight velvet of the gala or the simple disguise of the street corners. She wore a sharp, charcoal grey suit the colour of the city she was reclaiming. As she reached the podium, the sea of cameras flashed, a blinding wall of light that would have terrified her a month ago. But now, her eyes weren't searching for the exit. They were searching for the back of the room. 4 years. This city has been told a story about Laurent Global. Victoria began, her voice amplified by 100 speakers. A story of progress, of towers reaching for the clouds, and of a family that stood above the rest. But that story was built on a lie. It was built on the silence of men, like Thomas Cole, who saw the rot in the foundation and refused to look away. The room went silent. A heavy, expectant hush. In a world where everyone wanted something from me, my status, my passwords, my soul, there was one person who wanted nothing, she continued, her gaze finally locking onto a figure standing by the heavy oak doors. Ethan stood there, no longer in a faded vest, but still wearing the same quiet, unshakable integrity that had first confused her. He was the only one who saw me before the world did. He didn't see a billionaire lady. He saw a person who was just as lost as he was. Flashback, 24 hours ago, Victoria and Ethan had stood on the roof of his warehouse, watching the sunrise bleed over the Queensborough Bridge. "You're going to lose it all, aren't you?" Ethan had asked, his voice soft. The company, the penthouse, the name. Victoria had looked at her hands, finally free of the heavy sapphire ring she'd worn as a shield. "I'm not losing it, Ethan. I'm trading it. I'd rather have a life that's real than a kingdom that's a crime scene." She had reached out, taking his calloused hand in hers. "My father died trying to find someone he could trust. I think I finally found him for him. Present day, and that's why," Victoria said, her voice ringing with a final, shocking clarity. "I'm stepping down as CEO. I'm turning Laurent Global into a public trust to compensate the families of the Shoreline District. And I am doing it with the help of the man who saved my life, not just from a car, but from myself." She gestured toward the back. "Ethan, come up here." The whispers turned into a roar of disbelief. The elite circle of New York watched in stunned silence as the poor boy walked down the center aisle. He didn't look like he belonged on a corporate stage. But the way Victoria took his hand as he reached, her fingers interlocking, eyes bright with tears, shattered every assumption in the room. It was a publicity stunt to some, a tragedy to others, but to Victoria and Ethan, it was the first day of the rest of their lives. As they walked off the stage together, leaving the flashing cameras and the crumbling empire behind, Victoria leaned into him. "They're still shocked," she whispered. "Let them be," Ethan replied, his grip on her hand tightening as they stepped out into the New York sun. "They've been looking at the towers for too long. It's time they started looking at the people on the ground." The emotional closure was complete. The gap between their worlds hadn't just been bridged. It had been erased by a truth that cost everything and gained them the world. Asterisk, 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 asterisk.